A most unusual trend is unfolding in America. The number of deaths among middle-aged white Americans has been rising significantly since 1999. This is a major reversal of a decades-long life expectancy among this demographic group. It caught the attention of two Princeton University professors who decided to investigate what's going on with so many white Americans and why they are dying. Here's what they found. The deaths are largely driven by suicides, alcohol, and drug abuse, particularly the opioid epidemic, also chronic diseases such as heart disease and diabetes. Now, what's interesting about this is when you begin to examine these numbers, is having an impact when it comes to the demographic changes. And so one of the reasons we are becoming a more majority minority country is a result of white Americans dying at an earlier rate. There was a Time article actually a couple months ago that I found to be interesting, and even showed that in a number of states in about 5 years, the white death rate will actually surpass the white birth rate.
Wow.
Yes. No, that's real. That's real. That's what's going on. Joining me right now to talk about this via Skype from Princeton is one of the co-authors of the study, Professor Ann Case. So, Ann, what else? Give me some of your other takeaways from this.
Well, we started this work a couple of years ago, and when we realized that overdoses, suicide, alcohol were actually killing people in large enough numbers that now it's actually driven down the life expectancy, not just for whites, but for the country as a whole. We wondered, what is happening here? Why is this happening? So we dug deeper into the numbers, and it's at least associated with a lot of dysfunction, not getting married, a lot more cohabitation that's not stable, having kids out of wedlock that if then you move on, you lose contact with your kids, that's bad for you, that's bad for the kids, not participating in the labor force. And we think that underneath this, there could be a story about just the labor market pulling out from under white working class Americans.
And I gotta ask you this, and that is, black folks have issues in the labor market as well. Yeah. Is this a question that because of what's happening economically, white Americans can't handle stress?
You know, it's an interesting question. The historian Carol Anderson, in an article in Politico, said that for African Americans, if it's a case that you've always been oppressed, it's possible that you're resilient, whereas for whites, equality begins to look like oppression. And but I have to add to this, though, that while blacks are making great progress, have made great progress in bringing down mortality rates in middle age, there are some signs that things aren't all rosy there either. Since 2010, mortality from drug overdoses started to pick up again. And also, heart disease progress has begun to flatline for blacks as well. So it could be that the whites just led the herd on this. I think that there's real reason for trying to drill down into the black numbers as well and see what's going on there too.
What also I think jumps out at me, first of all, we got a couple of questions here. What also jumps out at me is when you look at these numbers, like all of a sudden, you see this in Vermont, and Connecticut, and New Hampshire. We saw during the Republican primary, where all of these white voters were asking for compassion when it comes to opioids. You know, again, black folks were saying, man, it sure would have been nice to see the same level of compassion when we had the crack epidemic in the 1980s that ravaged black communities. And now all of a sudden, you know, white folks in America are realizing when you talk about opioids, you talk about meth, yeah, the issue with drugs and the impact on families is real.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really a scandal, and it's really a shame that in the 80s and in the 90s, it was considered a criminal problem, and now it's considered a medical problem.
Yep.
But I think just because it was wrong before doesn't mean we shouldn't consider it a medical problem for everybody now.
Yeah, but here's the deal, though. The challenge for us is to get those same white Americans to call it a medical problem and stop the mass incarceration procedures that we're seeing that impact black folks, not others. Wilma, you have a question?
Well, more of an observation. It seems to me that what this is really a result of is that the same lies that white America has been telling us, they've been telling themselves. themselves. It's called white nationalism, it's called white supremacy and entitlement. And now what we find are working class Americans are finding their wages have been stagnant for the last 15 or 20 years. The things that they have come to believe that they are entitled to, they're no longer, the benefits they're no longer receiving. And they can't come to grips with a black president. All must now be wrong with America because they're having to mortgage their futures to pay for their president.
Got it. Avis.
You know, I wanted to say a couple of things, though. One is that we made a really big mistake, I think. We took heroin, we put it in pill form, we put an FDA stamp on it, and we said that OxyContin could be given out in large numbers to control pain. So the reason I think that this took off in places like Utah, places like northern Maine, Vermont,
Northern Virginia,
or it's actually, there's no part of the country that has not been touched by this. Mm-hmm. And I think the second thing, though, I wanted to say in response was just that there is a generation of whites who they may have been privileged by the color of their skin, but that's the only privilege they've ever known.
And
that's my point.
But that is a very real privilege that trickles down in a variety of ways of life. And so I think the point that you brought up previously is a very real point about this issue of this lack of resiliency that might have very real, dangerous health outcomes. You know, I'm wondering specifically with this population in terms of what you're seeing. You mentioned several different things that oftentimes people in the past have attributed to black culture. For example, this issue of drug use, this issue of single-parent families, all of these other sort of issues that you mentioned that we're now seeing reflected right now, largely in white culture. And in your research around that, do you see the same level of castigation around those outcomes, or are you beginning to see a more urgent desire to do something to shift those outcomes that's less sort of repressive in the same way that we're now looking at drug addiction in a very different way than we did back in the 80s?
And 30 seconds.
Mores have certainly changed a lot about cohabitation, about having children out of wedlock. In Europe, cohabitation is really the modal form of a couple staying together. It's very stable there. Here it's not stable. Here, at least among the white community, it's quite fragile. And that can lead to a lot more dysfunction. You don't have the kind of structure that you used to have in terms of a job, in terms of a family, in terms of legacy churches, which have, in the white community has given way to new kinds of churches, more seeking churches, which is fine if it works for you, but if it doesn't work for you, it's a risk for suicide.
All right, then. Well, we surely appreciate it. Thank you so very much for joining us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
A peaceful protest turned deadly. 37-year-old black man was shot and killed by Baton Rouge police. His hands are in the air, and you still get shot by the cops.
Oh my God, please don't tell me he's dead.
We're not gonna let hate define us.
Race is a big part of this.
If truly all lives matter, then all lives need to matter equally.
What we require is action. What we require is accountability. We understand that black lives do matter, and we will keep focused on this issue.
News 1 Now, every weekday morning at 7 on TV 1.